Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Absolution or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Faith, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Absolution Chapter 2. Safety First. The wall clock mocked Nicta from across the waiting room, warping time into some tortuously slow hellscape and grinding slower with each passing minute. Nicta was convinced it had been tampered with, probably as part of some social experiment to see which psychiatric patient they could drive up the wall first. There was probably a camera somewhere, watching them like rats in a cage and taking notes. She and Sarah had been sitting there forever, and Nicta was starting to get squirmy. Meanwhile, Sarah was the epitome of patience to her right. It was annoying how easily the former general melded into her surroundings despite being such a recognizable face. An illuminated exit sign was anchored to the clock's right, which only made things worse, like it was tormenting Nicta from afar. She tried not to fantasize about an escape plan, lest she be tempted and give Sarah a reason to chase her down. The woman ran like a cheetah, and Nicta was 4 feet tall by comparison. Switching tactics, she fixed her eyes on the ticking time bomb again. The clock was solid enough to withstand any subtle attempts at plucking it from the wall with her mind, though to be honest, she wasn't trying too hard for valid reasons. There were risks with her using work these days. Ones she really couldn't be taking. But the need to focus on something other than Sarah checking her watch every 10 seconds won out. There was a clock yelling at them, and the woman insisted on using her Rolex. Nicta didn't specialize in levitation or physical transference, but she was good at the silent and sneaky kind of work not a lot of witches possessed. She started with small pushes at it first, barely enough to register as anything, and gradually loosened her restraint to try and pluck out the nail that held the clock in place. After a moment, Nicta swore she saw something shift. A thrill rippled through her. Something so small shouldn't feel like a victory, but she would take what she could get these days. No one appeared out of thin air to arrest her anyway. Nicta doubled down on the silent attempts to wreck the clock. Maybe she could snap the ticking hands instead, all the while careful to keep her vocal cords from vibrating. Then, Sarah's hand appeared on her lap. Curling around the forearm, she draped loosely across it, and Nicta seized entirely. "Nick, stop," Sarah hissed, glancing around them as if the 2 people seated in the waiting room could be agents of the army, ready to take her out themselves. "You know you can't do that. What are you thinking?" Nicta's scowl was semi-permanent these last few days, but it deepened now and she crossed her arms in defiance, dislodging Sarah's hold. "Fine," she grumbled, slumping so deeply in her seat that her ass almost came over the edge. "Is she always this late, or—" 10 minutes is not late, Sarah cut in, and that drew a loud snort of disbelief from beside her. Nicta turned her eyes up at her mate and flashed her a crooked grin. "You are trying to tell me punctuality is irrelevant?" she quipped, and her mouth stretched wider when Sarah actually returned a look. "You must really not want to go in there if you're pretending you're not a stickler for time management. I seem to remember Tally turning you on with our last holiday schedule all penciled in and laminated." "Fine, I digress," Sarah relented, chuckling to herself at the memory and crossing her legs. "Perhaps if this doctor doesn't show at all, we can just tell Tally it went well and get a drink instead." If Sarah was willing to skip out on their first therapy session, then she must really not want to go. The mention of drinks was enough to make Nicta's mouth suddenly feel parched while she contemplated whether they could actually pull it off. What she wouldn't give to be sitting in a bar right now with her partner, rather than here in this office for 1 second longer. They could talk things out over a beer or 6 for old time's sake. At least she and Sarah still agreed on some things. Sarah elbowed her then, scowling at Nicta's widely spread legs and exaggerated posture, begrudging her to sit upright at once. Nicta only lasted a couple of seconds that way before compromising and slipping into a half-assed slouch instead. Sarah ground her teeth but let it go. "Sarah and Nicta Alder?" came a voice from the end of the hall minutes later, and the two witches shared a look of resignation as they stood up. Both contemplated pretending it wasn't them, except even retired General Alder had standards about keeping appointments. She was such a goody two-shoes. Nicta stayed rooted in place while Sarah approached the doctor, only to pivot back and take Nicta forcefully by the arm, hauling the pouty teenager in a woman's body after her. They paused in front of the assumed therapist. She smiled politely and extended a hand. "I'm Dr. Gudrun Barr. Please, take a seat in my office and I'll be with you both in a minute." Nicta grunted her reply and pushed past them. She ignored the offered hand, leaving Sarah to smile apologetically and hurry after her. "Would you sit down, please?" Sarah begged after 5 minutes of watching Nicta pace around like a caged tiger. She was careful to keep her expression sympathetic when Nicta turned and glared at her, while aware of her partner's hang-ups when it came to new and enclosed spaces. Public spaces, at that. Right away upon entering the room, Sarah had opened both sets of curtains over the corner windows, drawing enough light in so that some of Nicta's tension eased, whether she was aware of it or not. Nicta still glared at every object suspiciously and contemplated the darkened corners like they might hide something sinister, which was a bit dramatic if Sarah had a say, but she kept her mouth shut in the name of peace. Instead, she sat patiently on the couch and hoped Nicta would get it out of her system before the doctor returned, preferably sometime this century. "Nick," Sarah tried again after she failed to get a response, dropping her head to one side and willing Nicta to take a seat next to her. She was sorely tempted to push the response, but only if Nicta started to look like she might run for it. A good immobilizing spell would do wonders for her partner's ADHD, she considered briefly. Sarah knew, however, that she would never truly force the issue using work. That was a level of trust she would not break with her partners. Anytime she helped Nicta with her anxiety, it was always with consent, even if Nicta was in a mood and refused something Sarah knew would do her good. The only exception she made was for the nightmares. Nicta didn't always remember her times she trashed about in her sleep or woke briefly enough to a calming song from Sarah or Tally. Sarah chose not to remind her of those moments as a kindness. Finally, Nicta harumphed her way over and collapsed like a pissed-off rhinoceros next to Sarah, slamming her feet onto the coffee table in front of them. Sarah's lips pursed and Nicta had a smirk, partially doing it just to annoy her. "Please," Sarah murmured, shoving Nicta's shoes from the table and quickly brushing off the dirt they left behind. "Let's just remind ourselves that we're here for Tally, shall we?" "I thought we were here for us." Nicta shared a look of disdain with her girlfriend. It was no secret neither of them believed this would do a damn thing, and that they had a lot to work out on their own, which they wanted to, truthfully, just not in front of a civilian stranger. A psychic, a pyromaniac, and a 300-year-old tree walk into a therapist's office. But it was for Tally. Sarah was right about that, so in the end, Nicta acquiesced with a nod and forced herself to sit upright again. They lapsed into silence, during which Nicta distracted her nerves with a Newton's cradle toy conveniently placed on the table in front of them. She repeatedly dropped one steel ball against the bunch, watching it click-clack back and forth, eventually working her way up to 3 balls bouncing side to side as a unit. Beside her, Sarah had turned her focus on a tiny bonsai Zen garden that sat in the center of the table. She was the picture of calm as she began tracing lines in the white sand with her fingernail, smoothing perfect waves across the surface, each one matching what came before it. The intricate pattern ebbed and flowed seamlessly, as though the Zen garden existed on a beach somewhere with a calm breeze rather than in an indoor office void of moving air. Nicta growled beside her and suddenly kicked up a foot again, banging into the side of the table when she lost her patience. The whole thing lurched and Sarah's fingertip struck a line straight through the careful work she'd just spent 5 minutes creating. Pausing, Sarah blinked at the mess in front of her and slowly turned her head to glare at Nicta. Lesser human beings had been cowed by the same expression. Nicta was barely sheepish. Nicta opted to keep her foot on the table regardless and reclined with both hands fixed behind her head. "Oops," she retorted, biting back a smirk when Sarah's mouth thinned until it nearly disappeared. Teasing Sarah was Nicta's safe space, mostly because she knew Sarah let her do it on purpose, and she was finally starting to relax when the door banged open and set off her nervous system all over again. She jumped so hard she accidentally kicked the Newton's cradle halfway across the coffee table and swore while scrambling to untangle it. Beside her, Sarah watched with a lot more patience than one would think, eventually reaching across and resting a hand over Nicta's. They were shaking around the object. "Relax," she whispered, and Nicta puffed out a breath, shooting Sarah a sardonic smile when they both knew that wasn't likely to happen. Nicta failed miserably at hiding how on edge she was, and Sarah could feel her heart pounding relentlessly against the inside of her ribcage when she searched for it. There wasn't much Nicta could hide from her anymore. "Sorry to keep you waiting," the therapist announced after pausing at her desk long enough to set down some files. She kept a notebook in hand and smiled politely as she took a seat across from the two witches. "I think we can start with some instructions. You can call me Dr. Barr, if you wish, or my first name, Gudrun. I've been with the armed forces for 2 years now, and, as you probably know, specialize in assisting discharged soldiers." Silence reigned while Gudrun politely indicated for one of them to take up the next line. It didn't look like they were getting anything out of Nicta without a lobotomy, so Sarah went first. "Sarah Alder," she stated, tilting her chin in a manner she had grown accustomed to over the years. There was no one who met her that wasn't well aware of who they were speaking to. Nicta rolled her eyes, which Sarah also ignored. "Retired general, 318 years running," she continued. "I gather you're aware that our situation is rather unique, and will adjust your expectations." Nicta snorted. If she has expectations, she's in for a surprise. Sarah narrowed her eyes ever so slightly, the only indication she'd received a message. Both parties waited patiently for Nicta to speak next. She was fidgeting on the couch again, repeatedly bouncing her leg around like a nervous tick she couldn't stop. "Nicta," she eventually grunted, and there was no missing the menace in her eyes as she fixed the doctor with a defiant stare. "Batan." Sarah immediately felt an uptick in Nicta's stress level and ached to reach out again. If there was one thing she could get wrong at the very beginning of this session, however, it would be to coddle the only person in the room who wouldn't hesitate to blow a hole in the wall. Nicta didn't take well to showing weakness. To her, weakness ate you alive. Gudrun didn't respond to Nicta's malice, nor did she seem distressed by it. "It's a pleasure to be working with you both," she said kindly, and Sarah's respect for the doctor went up a notch. "First off, I want to assure you that anything said in this room is entirely confidential, and that my only goal here is to help you with whatever you feel you need assistance unpacking. I don't submit reports to the Army, if that's cause for concern, as you're no longer on active duty." Nicta's harried energy wasn't calmed, and she folded both hands, leaning forward in an effort to appear casual. "The Hague?" she asked through a rough growl. There was an uncomfortable pop in her jaw from tension, and her legs started bouncing around again like she sat on a trampoline. "No, nor The Hague," Gudrun assured her without missing a beat. "Everything that happens here stays between us." Sarah didn't miss the way Nicta shot a quick look at the exit behind Gudrun, nor the irritation marks appearing on her wrist as she started scratching away at an invisible itch. Gudrun and Sarah exchanged a few words about their reasons for being here to give Nicta a moment to settle. Sarah told her that their third party, Tally, had asked them to cope with a complication that had arisen recently over moving to a more populated area. The entire time, Sarah was watching Nicta's demeanor like a hog from the corner of her eye, sympathy etching into her features the longer Nicta appeared to unravel. Finally, Sarah broke off the conversation and turned her full attention to the woman beside her, resting a hand on her back. Nicta bristled, and Sarah ignored it, instead leaning forward to try and catch her eye. Nicta wouldn't give in. Her own were wild and staring straight ahead at the space her foot had occupied on the table, where the tangled ruins of Newton's cradle still lay. At some point her insides had turned to stone, and Sarah could feel her anxiety reaching its peak. "Nick," Sarah whispered, waiting for Nicta to jerk her head in her direction, and even then Nicta was only half willing to look at her. "Can I?" Nicta gritted her teeth and slammed her eyes closed. She nodded anyway, while her foot continued to bounce around in aggravation. She didn't want help, but she needed it, and Sarah was grateful Nicta was aware enough to accept so. Sarah shifted closer and pitched a seed under her breath, waiting for it to settle in the air and pushing it towards her partner at the right moment. Nicta quivered when the effect started to take hold. Gradually, much too slowly for her liking, the tension holding her hostage began to melt away. Sarah focused a small link on her central nervous system and did her best to ease the cortisol flooding through her body. An overwhelming sensation of helplessness caused Nicta to shiver and pretend she was elsewhere. She refused to be humiliated in front of a virtual stranger that no doubt had her personal opinions on the psyche of one Nicta Baton long before she saw her have a meltdown in her office. Talk about adding fuel to the fire. Nicta wanted to scream. After 30 seconds or so, Sarah could tell Nicta was at her limit for what she would accept in public, and she seized her song. The hand centered on Nicta's back stayed in place, adjusting to a soothing rub, while Nicta slowly willed her muscles to relax. The air surrounding her grew lighter, and Sarah was satisfied she had done enough to head off the worst of it. She wanted to give Nicta a moment to gather herself, so she turned her attention to the therapist, watching them from across the coffee table. Hawk blue eyes were piercing and protective, while her tone remained matter-of-fact. Nicta has trouble with enclosed spaces sometimes, and unfamiliar people. Perhaps in the future we can keep the windows open and schedule things closer to midday. It wasn't a question, and no one in the room was left with the impression she had tried to make it one. Beside her, Nicta kept her eyes shut, but twitched with a bitter smile. If she minded Sarah speaking up for her, she didn't say anything. "Of course we can do that," Gudrun agreed, making a quick note. "If you need a few minutes to settle in, Nicta, I can give you two some privacy. We have a full hour, so there's no harm in taking a pause to collect your—" "No." Nicta's gaze finally settled on the therapist again. The challenge in it was gone, and she was able to sit up straighter this time. "Let's get this over with." She absently rubbed her sweaty palms on black jeans. "Sooner we get out of here, the better." Sarah wondered if she had pushed Nicta too far by helping in mixed company, but Nicta only shot her a grateful little smile at the moment, accompanied by a quick nod to say she was okay. Reluctantly, Sarah withdrew her hand and placed it politely back in her lap. "There's a starting place for you," Nicta mumbled under her breath, sagging into the couch while looking significantly more steady. "Guess there's no point in telling you that I don't have any issues, huh?" "Actually, you may be surprised to hear how many of my clients have some form of post-traumatic stress disorder," the therapist commented. "The military might only recently be acknowledging that mental health is an important support to offer, but I assure you I'm well versed in how to assist you in addressing things like panic attacks or social anxieties." "Yeah, it's not a someone shot at me in the war type thing," Nick grunted, letting her eyes wander away from the other two occupants. She scratched roughly at her nose. "Anyway, we're here for Tally. She and Sarah want to move back to the city. I don't. Discuss." Sarah knew full well how uncomfortable Nicta would be after starting off in such an obvious manner, and chose to jump in. Her own discomfort was barely beneath the surface, but she would rather steer the conversation somewhere else, while Nicta had a chance to come around to the thought of talking in her own time. Their own issues aside, Sarah realized how beneficial this could be to Nicta, if only she would let it. "Our partner, Tally, has some concerns about our relationship with each other. Nicta and I," she clarified. The three of us have been together for approximately a year and a half since Nick's release from Fort Myer Correctional Facility. Prior to that, she was imprisoned in a maximum security witch prison operated by The Hague. Let's not play the pretend game. You know exactly who I am and what came later, Nicta cut in, once again fixing the therapist with a smoldering glare. She wasn't nearly as tense as before, but Sarah still rested a hand on her knee and drew her attention back. Love, she's not here to attack you. She's here to help us, she reminded her gently. She's a civilian, Nicta grunted, glaring back at Dr. Bauer. Am I right? I'm having a little trouble thinking a civilian has any interest in something other than locking me away underground again. I can assure you that's not a problem you need to worry about, Gundren said evenly, her expression surprisingly unaffected. To be blunt, Miss Batan, I'm not paid to have an opinion. I'm here to help you and your wife work through the things you see fit to, and perhaps along the way assist you in reintegration, if that's a direction you find you're comfortable with. Girlfriend, Nicta corrected. Sarah and Tally are married. I'm not. A choice you made, Sarah quickly jumped in, blinking when Nicta huffed at that. I don't want any registered papers of any kind, Nicta explained to Bauer before she could get the wrong idea. Besides, handfesting is hardly going to fix our little issue of living in different places. I see. Bauer made a few notes. To answer your first question, I'll be forward in that, yes, I do recall the media sensation that followed your release from custody. She crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap. I can't begin to imagine how difficult or stressful that must have been for you all. Nicta flumped back again and stared at the wall. Yeah, it sucked. So when my partner insists I should be cool with moving back to a city full of people that want my head on a spike, you can see why I'm a little bit pissed. Sarah flinched and immediately drew her hand away. A coolness settled back into the room. Why don't we get into that in a little while, Dr. Bauer suggested. I'd like you to tell me more about your relationship with each other, and perhaps start closer to the beginning. Nicta immediately laughed, loudly. Shit! I guess I'll take a nap then while you two cover the first 280-something years. I don't think we need to go that far back, the good doctor mused, while Sarah just looked exasperated. Why don't you start with how you met? That brought silence, shallow and uncomfortable. Somewhere in the office, another clock ticked loudly. Sarah folded her hands in her lap and dared a look at Nicta, who happened to be peeking at her at the same time. Their eyes met, and Nicta offered a singular shrug. Sarah assumed responsibility for starting them off. Nicta and I were in an active war zone for 8 months in the early 90s. We grew closer during the mission. She was the first woman in a long time that I'd... It was Nicta's turn to frown when Sarah stopped talking. She almost asked her to continue that thought, instead clamping her mouth shut and opting to let Sarah go ahead as she pleased. Sarah ground her jaw together and righted herself, then continued. We entered into a consensual relationship during that time. I was quite happy. I don't presume to speak for Nicta. Nicta's dramatic eye roll matched the statement as far as she was concerned. I was too, or I wouldn't have put up with your shit, she grumbled. And despite her exasperation, she shot Sarah a tiny smile. For all their faults, it hadn't always been so bad. Not in the beginning. Not before the rest. Sarah took that in and became somber. I had to make a judgment call based on the situation. I used work that Nicta had devised to kill the group of rebels that we had been tracking. It wasn't meant to be personal, but of course it was. Things like that always are. Nicta fidgeted again and scratched at her ear. Look, we really don't need to rehash this part. I was angry, I took that anger and fueled it into creating the spree. Sarah and I spent over 20 years fighting for opposite things. Then the Camarilla returned and we got over it. You make it sound so simple, Gudrun mused, raising an eyebrow. A deep and personal betrayal isn't something one simply gets over. You might forgive the other person, they might forgive you back, but it doesn't mean it's all forgotten at the end of the day. Feelings linger no matter how badly we want to keep them in the past. We have forgiven each other, Sarah said evenly, and again exchanged a quick check with Nicta, who nodded from the side. Entering another war, and quite frankly coming back to life as a higher power for those few months, changed things for me. I was able to see beyond what my immortal life had allowed me to up to that point, and Nicta and I worked out our differences over those 2 years. Yeah, I may have wanted to kill you sometimes, but you were always still a hottie, Nicta teased, waggling her eyebrows in a suggestive manner. Sarah chuckled, and some of their shared discomfort eased. I suspect there's a bit more to that, the therapist said. How did things end after the betrayal of trust? Awkwardness stilled both parties. They were undoubtedly thinking the same things. Sarah betraying Nicta by stealing her pushwork, Nicta trying to burn her throat out and later pull her apart at the limbs, Sarah trying to execute her in front of the nation. It was Nicta who first cleared her throat and made an attempt to answer. The usual lies, deceit, hurtful words. She flashed Gundren an innocent smile and, considering how unnatural that state was for her, probably failed miserably. We did have a few close calls, Sarah added after a beat. Tally too, at one point or another. Tally too? Gudrun raised an eyebrow. Yes. She did step in when I was expected to execute Nicta early and before the war, Sarah said stiffly. Her frown deepened, and suddenly she was the squirming and uncomfortable one. Dr. Bauer took a moment to wrap her head around that. Oh, it sounds worse than it is, Nicta supplied, as casually as could be. I got over it. Tally got her ass handed to her, but in the end we're all still here and sitting pretty 8 years later, so really no harm done. Bauer fiddled with her pen. Just to clarify, you mean the 3 of you have at least, at one point or another, tried to kill each other? Other than Tally, with Nicta, I suppose, Sarah said mildly, as though they were discussing past dinner plans gone awry. She tried to club me to death with a rock once, Nicta offered, and Sarah hummed her concession that she was wrong. I see. Gudrun didn't show a reaction one way or another, just glanced at her notes and scribbled a few things down. Nicta shot a look at Sarah and mouthed, "What the hell?" spreading her hands and being met with an equally confused shrug. Their lives sounded much more insane when spoken out loud like that. It was almost comical. How did you each come to be with Tally? Tally's name itself was enough to relax them both. She was easier to discuss, not because she wasn't there, but because she was a soft spot for both of them. Sarah and Tally were married before I was released from prison, Nicta acknowledged. They're the reason I was able to secure an early release. When I got out, they let me into their life and things just sort of happened organically from there. Ah, recognition registered in the doctor's eyes. I can imagine that will be difficult at times, being the partner last in the house, so to speak, especially if your marital status varies. Technically, I planted my flag in this one about 2 decades before Tal, but sure. Nicta flashed Sarah a flirty grin and waggled her eyebrows. Sarah chewed on her lower lip. Tally was in love with Nicta when she went to prison, she countered. After the war, it wasn't easy for me to watch her grieve someone else and know she was struggling to let them go. Nicta rolled her eyes. Tal was fine. She married you like 6 months later. She moved on. Because you tried to make her. Nicta fidgeted some more and glared at Sarah. I wanted her to be happy, Sarah. As much as I hated it back then, you made her happy. Kept her safe. I didn't think she'd ever set eyes on me again. So yes, I stopped communicating for a while. 2 years. Sarah's eyes were sharp and she worked hard to shove something down that welled up from deep inside of her. We didn't hear a word from Nicta for 2 years despite pushing the Hague to let us see her. Sarah, Nicta groaned, rubbing her face. Can we not? That's really not the issue here. You see, when I do try to discuss things that matter, I get shut down, Sarah shot back, waving a flippant hand. This carries through to everything, and that includes our most recent discussion to move locations. I can't have a conversation when you don't want to. You shut down or walk away from me. It's not a conversation when you've already decided the outcome every damn time, Nicta snapped back, and it was a therapist who had to raise her hand. All right, Gudrun spoke up. drawing a ceasefire that both witches struggled to respect. They kept staring at each other until Nicta looked away first. I think we can pause for a moment. I'm hearing a lot of accusations and assumptions being thrown around, whether they're justified or not. That's grounds for making everyone as defensive as possible and makes it difficult to communicate meaningfully. Oh, please, don't tell me this is where you start using I statements, Nicta groaned. She'd had a few farcical therapy sessions in prison before her release, and wanted to gag at the thought of going through the motions again. Yes, Dr. Bowers stated plainly. It is, actually. I would like you and Sarah to practice that in your communications at home. When you're speaking about a subject, for better or worse, frame it as how you are feeling in that moment. Actively choose not to put a label on the other person's intentions. Simply state how what they're saying or doing makes you feel. I feel, Sarah began before Nicta could cut in again, that perhaps you never truly did forgive me for my part in our past, and that you choose to trot out your distrust whenever it's convenient to justify your anger with me. How can I? Nicta huffed before she could stop herself. You never failed to make me feel like my opinion in an argument is just as disposable as I was to you in Liberia. Sarah blinked at that and straightened. Nick, you are not. Whatever. Nick stood up and glared at them both. Hour's up, right? Nicta, sit down. Please, Dr. Bauer spoke up when Nicta continued to hover on the edge of fleeing. Just take a breath, relax your expectations, and give yourself a minute. No one is making accusations. You're simply discussing how the other person's actions make you feel. Nicta eyed up the exit across the room, and it took everything inside of her to sit her ass back down, rather than escape as fast as her legs could carry her. Now that we've established some language boundaries, Dr. Bauer continued, scribbling notes as she spoke, when was the last time you were intimate without your other partner? Nicta nearly fled for the door again. Seriously? Yes, Gudrun glanced up at them. I'm not asking for specifics. I'm trying to gauge where your tensions have sunk deepest into your lives. You're staying in separate bedrooms or together? Together, they answered at once, and for some reason that made them both blush. There's no great divide between us, at least not enough to make us sleep apart, Sarah added. Most of the time our lives are simpler, our relationship more relaxed. We just blow up every once in a while and usually over the important things. It was Nicta's turn to grumble. Gudrun hummed. So when was the last time you two were intimate alone, without your other partner there as a buffer? Nicta bit the inside of her cheek to hold in the remarks she wanted to make. Sarah looked deeply uncomfortable at this topic of discussion. Oh yes, Nicta thought to herself with a chuckle. She would love to see Sarah try and explain that one to the good doc. 3 weeks ago. Nicta's roundhouse landed square on Sarah's hip and sent the general to the mat with a hard grunt. She backed off and skirted away on the balls of her feet, keeping her stance loose and at the ready. As expected, Sarah came at her without much of a breather, and they exchanged blows for a long stretch back and forth, grunting and groaning and hissing with satisfaction each time one landed. They were always intense, always going just below the line of full out. Both of them typically walked away with bruises and occasionally bloody noses, but then they had enough talent between them to heal the minor things. Tally, as always, loved to watch. She was an adept fighter herself, but outside of training hours, she never wanted to get in between them. At least not when they were beating the crap out of each other. Weirdly enough, it was how they flirted. Nicta's grin was permanently plastered in place, even when she failed to outmaneuver Sarah and an elbow cross-clipped her jaw. She stumbled back a half-step, seeing stars, and not a full second passed before steadying hands were gripping her arms. Let me see, Sarah ordered gruffly, letting Nicta give her head a shake for clarity before taking her chin and tilting it so she could get a good look. It would bruise. Nicta could already feel one forming, but the wicked grin she flashed her partner never missed a beat. Lucky shot, she quipped, hiding a shiver when Sarah's thumb grazed the tender flesh. I was distracted by Tally's tits. Tally's eye roll could be heard from across the home gym. Liar! She called back from her perch on one of the vaulting horses they kept tucked in the corner. She still glanced down at herself and wondered how Nicta could possibly be distracted by her boobs in a gray t-shirt. Sarah was interested too and took her eyes away from Nicta for half a second, and Nicta took advantage. She grabbed and twisted one of Sarah's arms over her shoulder and threw her body weight into it, hauling all 12 feet of the general over her shoulder and slamming her back into the ground. Sarah went down hard and the air burst from her lungs, yet somehow she managed to sweep Nicta's feet out from under her at the same time. Nicta yelped and hit the mat next to her. Across the gym, Tally sighed and hopped down from the vault. Okay, assuming at some point you two just whip it out and measure who's bigger, I'll be in the house. Not that she didn't enjoy watching these two fine specimens throw each other around, but she had her promotional exam in 2 days, and Nicta and Sarah would always find excuses to wail on each other. Both were panting hard for breath and watched Tally go from upside down. We could call it, Sarah suggested, pushing up to her elbows. The special glint in her eyes said otherwise, but she was leaving it up to Nicta. Still out of breath, Nicta flashed Sarah a grin and crunched her abdomen, then threw her legs forward and leapt to her feet. Not done with you yet, she challenged, watching Sarah use the same move to get up. There was a hunger in her eyes as she watched Sarah's body move, fluid and graceful, and every inch of her deadlier than the last. She was the epitome of beautiful and harsh, the Ferrari to Nicta's Thunderbird, and Nicta's hunger for triumph grew to include more than winning for pleasure. She wanted her, more. She wanted to take what was hers. Sarah recognized the look, drank it in, and internalized the same need suddenly flooding her veins and pulsing between her legs. I will not hold back if you don't want me to, she promised. Nicta was more aggressive with her than she would ever be with Tally, and truthfully, it aroused Sarah just as much as it did Nicta. They had a competitive streak, sure, but the loser quite often ended up in a more compromising position. Nicta took the first swing, and within 3 hits it was game on. She had always been a pit bull in close quarters combat, and her aggression came out in short, violent spurts on the battlefield. It was one of the first things Sarah noticed about her all those years ago. Nicta could be in a fight for her life and still carry a shit-eating grin on her face the entire time. She thrived on the thrill of it. Matching blow for blow, Sarah took a couple of direct hits before she finally managed to turn the tide, using Nicta's aggressive energy against her. A part of her debated going easy and letting her win, but something told her that Nicta needed, a fair match right now. She grabbed and twisted Nicta's arm, taking her to her knees and wrapping the other firmly around her neck in a chokehold, minus the choking. Sarah's grin was breathless and triumphant. Do you yield? Nicta tried to wrench away the shoulder Sarah had pulled tightly behind her. Fuck off, she spat out, twisting to throw Sarah's weight forward. Not this time. This time Sarah held firm, and Nicta howled with fury. A heated mouth pressed to Nicta's ear, drawing breath and murmuring the hint of a seed into it. Nicta's struggle lessened, and her eyelids drooped, though it didn't kill the fight in her entirely. Yield, the voice crooned, sending a ripple of pleasure straight through Nicta's entire body and settling between her legs. Fucking cheater, Sarah was. No. Nicta managed to grunt even as she spread her legs more and Sarah popped her arm at an angle, shoving her chest into the floor. She was pissed off and tossed her weight back, but Sarah managed to get her legs separated and pinned with her own, and the weight on her back made getting up impossible. I said yield, Sergeant Batan, Sarah spat, growling harshly against Nicta's ear and biting down on the nape of her neck. Nicta released a furious snarl and gave one last attempt to free herself. Sarah switched a hold on her arms and shoved a hand down the back of Nicta's shorts, cupping her sex and digging her fingers into her wet cunt. Yield, came the purr of a pussycat this time, and Nicta's body finally gave in. Sarah took her hard and fast against the mat, easing the pressure on her arm so it didn't snap, but she kept it pinned into Nicta's back, and her body shoved into the ground in submission. Nicta was furious with her, and horny as fuck all at the same time, given she had planned for this to go in reverse. Sarah's fingers were long and lithe, ruthless and rough, teasing and careful all at the same time. They twisted and pulled, scissored and dug deeper, bringing Nicta to the brink against her will. Everything between them was consent, now and forever, but Nicta still buried her face into the mat when she came and bucked wildly against her partner in shame. Her ass ground back into the hand buried in her pants, and Sarah thrust her hips forward to keep her in place. Only once her orgasm hit did Sarah release her arm and Nicta slammed it into the mat, raking her fingers against the rubber. Sarah's grin was arrogant as she leaned across the prone woman and bit down hard against her ear a second time. "Healed," she husked, and when Nicta begrudgingly smacked the floor with her hand, Sarah chuckled. Nicta's bones were jello, and it took a minute for her to peel her face off of the mat. Her vision was still blurry, but she could make out the image of 2 feet standing in the doorway across from them. Slowly, her eyes trailed up Tally's body, a mixture of humiliation and leftover arousal making her sluggish and slow to focus. There was no denying the flush of heat in Tally's cheeks from what she had witnessed, but Nicta picked up on some turmoil in those brown eyes. Tally looked like she didn't know whether to be turned on or slightly disturbed. Nicta mustered up a quick smirk for her girlfriend and tried to play off the fact that Sarah was still on top of her, and no doubt smirking like an asshole. "She cheated," Nicta grunted, earning a swear from Sarah and a hard swat on the ass as she pulled out of her. Nicta grimaced and pushed up to her elbows, taking a beat to gather herself. "Pretty sure using work to dumbfuck your girlfriend doesn't count, General." Sarah gave Nicta a haggard glare and made a show of whipping her cum-slick hand on Nicta's shirt, smirking when Nicta made a face of protest. "Just as I'm sure you'll teach me a lesson next time," she crooned, and there was no mistaking the smolder behind those icy blue eyes. Nicta growled and forced herself into a kneeling position again, shooting Sarah a hard glare as the lanky bitch strolled past Tally and disappeared back inside the house. Present day. Nicta cleared her throat and tried really hard to come up with an explanation that didn't require so much personal detail. "We do have a sex life by ourselves, but lately it's mostly been the 3 of us." Sarah didn't speak up either. They were both working hard not to make eye contact. The memory itself nearly had Nicta flustered. What was she supposed to tell this woman? How was it the last time you had sex without your third partner there? Hot, infuriating, fun, humiliating, a thrill. Even Nicta knew it sounded screwed up if she dared to speak it out loud. She and Sarah had always been fire and fury. They fucked better when they were angry, with each other or at the world. Before the spree, their anger was directed at the world. Nicta couldn't necessarily say that at this time. "It was fun," Nicta settled on, and she could feel Sarah's eyes burning a hole in the side of her face. She shrugged uselessly and stretched back on the couch, extending her legs in front of her and kicking the edge of the coffee table. "Sex isn't really an issue with us." Gudrun's attention flitted between the 2 of them, watching how Sarah gazed at her partner with a frown and how Nicta stared absently at the table in front of them. Having sex with someone you love doesn't need to be the root of the issue for there to be concerns. It can give us clues as to where your headspace may be at. Could you tell me how you felt after the last time you were alone together? Nicta snuck a peek at Sarah, surprised to see the soft intensity shining through those blue eyes of hers. She didn't remember the last time Sarah was this quiet and let somebody speak about her without chiming in her opinion. "Frustrated," came out of Nicta's mouth before she even realized it. The surprise flickering in Sarah's expression was reflected in her own, and Nicta abruptly jerked her head back to Bauer. "I mean, she cheated and I totally would have won otherwise." Sarah's mouth pulled into a thin smile, and she glanced down at her hands. "Nick and I can be intense. More so than when we're with Tally." She risked another glance at the woman sitting next to her. "When we're with her, there's a different rhythm. Things are softer, easier with each other in her presence. That's not to say we don't have our own moments. They're just a bit more..." Even Nicta struggled to put it into words. Fiery wasn't the right phrase. Things were plenty full of fire and passion with Tally. Charged, maybe? She offered, and looked surprised at herself for even trying. Nicta's skin crawled at the idea of spilling her bedroom details to a virtual stranger, and she found her focus wandering out the window to Sarah's right. I like our sex life, she said evenly. Always have. I won't feel ashamed if it's unconventional at times. Me neither, Sarah agreed, and for once Nicta didn't hesitate to believe her. Was it always that way, before you two parted ways in Liberia? Nicta snapped her attention back to the therapist and bristled at the question. What the hell is that supposed to mean? The woman blinked serenely at them and continued, unfazed. Is there a difference in how your sexual relationship functions now compared to before you separated the first time? We already know there's a difference in your day-to-day domestic lives. I'm wondering if that extends to your intimacy. Nicta furrowed her brow and suddenly couldn't look directly at Sarah. I was practically a kid then. You were not, Sarah interrupted, clearing her throat. You were young, but you were never naive. In fact, she pursued me in the matter. I was more hesitant, given my status as her superior officer. Nicta's smirk cracked wide open, and she leaned forward, dropping her head sideways at Sarah. There was no mistaking the heat in her eyes. Oh yeah, we had fun with that one, she practically purred, and it was Sarah's turn to look uncomfortable. We were in a war zone, Sarah said. For months. Our personal relationship was a space away from the death and destruction. I never wanted to hurt. Sarah trailed off and Nicta's smirk dropped away. The air between them grew cold again when she didn't continue. Nicta licked her lips and shot the therapist a dirty look, shrugging one shoulder like she was tossing off the creature whispering doubts and dark thoughts into her ear. Whatever, it was what it was. I'm saying I'm older now, less naive. Of course it's different, but there are also no more secrets or ranks to worry about. We're not in the middle of a war. We just finished one. Sometimes coming home and pretending we're still who we used to be is the hardest part, Dr. Bauer countered. Nicta looked severely annoyed at the parry. You're right. You're not as young as you were the first time you two were together. We've established the fact that you were also on opposite sides of a war for 2 decades, until things shifted to the Camarilla. Suddenly you found yourselves fighting together again, which probably made it easier to let your past slide. Rekindled feelings can often move things along faster than we probably need them to. Forgiveness is not the same thing as forgetting, Sarah spoke, and this time she was the one who stared into her hands. No, it's not. The pager beside Dr. Bauer went off, and she quickly checked it, issuing an apology as she stood up. I'll give you both a minute and be right back. You may continue to talk about things or wait until we resume. It's up to you, but I encourage you both to stay. Sarah nodded her thanks while Nicta sulked and waited until they were left alone in the room. Silence, the heavy kind that made them both fidget. That fucking clock continued ticking. After a minute or so of nothing else, Nicta rubbed her hands together and blew out a hard breath. How is it that you nearly executing me on live TV and me trying to burn you to a cinder are the least of our problems? That got a laugh from Sarah, and while it didn't break the tension entirely, it did seem to help. Nicta continued to shift her weight back and forth. I statements, huh? She cast a longing stare at Sarah, whose brow creased as she tried to read Nicta's intentions. Nicta kept her expression carefully guarded. Don't think I'm not aware of what you and Tal did for me. Nicta really had to fight with herself not to look away. You saved my life, took me into your home. That's the truth. I'm grateful beyond words, Sarah. The marriage thing is a formality and it doesn't bug me. Sarah softened and tentatively took up Nicta's hand again, relieved when Nicta squeezed it back and held on. I love you. Tally has always loved you. And there was no other choice. We wanted you to be where you belonged. With us. Her smile was guarded too, but there was hope in it. Outside, the sun peeked out from behind the clouds, and Nicta felt its warmth for the first time that morning. Sarah's hand stayed nestled in her own. I statements, huh? Nicta mused, rolling her eyes and leaning back in defeat. Well, this ought to be fun. Of all the days to schedule in a little car shopping, this was one hell of a place to start. Nicta whined that they should just go home and relax after their session. But Sarah was insistent they follow through with their plans to get Nicta her own mode of transportation. For over a year, she had avoided getting a license or any kind of idea, lest someone at the DMV leak her address and information. Sarah had finally convinced Nicta to let her pull some strings and come up with a fake set of identification. It was registered with the proper authorities, and the former general ensured it had no way of being tracked back to their house. The only issue was that Tally's SUV took her to work each day, and Sarah's Hummer was a monstrosity Nicta couldn't bring herself to drive. She was also too short to do so safely, something Tally never ceased to tease her about. The next time that girl made a booster seat comment, Nicta was going to burn all that pretty hair off of her head. "I feel," Nicta began, as she and Sarah stood in front of a lineup of minivans and hatchbacks, "that I'm not a middle-aged soccer mom looking to tote around 16 kids and a bag of balls every Sunday." "I feel that you're right, and this isn't a vehicle of choice for you," Sarah agreed, and the two of them exchanged a slight smile. They had been playing up the I statements the whole way here, and that included picking up Tally from Fort Salem along the way. Beside them, Tally rolled her eyes in exasperation. "They're fuel efficient and blend in, that's all I meant," she grumbled, pouting when the two of them laughed at her. "Tally, can you really see me in a minivan?" Nicta grinned, poking her in the side. Sarah had flamed Nicta's chosen alter ego phase to hide her identity for the day, but the features and statue were still close enough to her natural setting that they both easily knew it was her underneath. "I'm gonna hotwire Sarah's Hayabusa before setting foot in that dorkmobile." "I will strike you down so fast you will not see it coming," Sarah said evenly, and neither of them believed she was kidding. Sarah's outrageously pricey racing bike was off limits to everyone but her. "Exactly." Nicta stuffed her hands in her pockets and moved down the aisle while they waited for the overzealous salesman to find them again. This whole experience was making her cagey, and it had nothing to do with being out in public. The truth of the matter was, she was broke. The government had seized any assets she'd had and sucked her dry while she was locked up halfway across the world. She didn't have a penny to her name, and had been bullish for a year now about not letting Sarah just outright buy her a vehicle. Life was harder now, with Tally working more often, and Nicta didn't want to be a burden. She hated the idea of Sarah having to spend money because she was too useless to procure her own. Sarah, of course, never made her feel this was anything but a sensible decision, considering she was loaded, and somehow that made Nicta feel worse. She found herself in a section that showcased some flashy-looking sports cars. A black coupe caught her eye, small and speedy-looking, and she did a couple of laps around the car for fun. "Something tells me she's exactly what you're looking for." The aforementioned sales associate beamed, appearing out of thin air and making Nicta jump. She scowled. He was lucky she didn't accidentally fry his ass. His expression gave him away, and Nicta worked her face into something a little less terrifying. "I'm just browsing," she grunted, and he almost took the hint when Sarah and her leather jacket, that cost more than their house, appeared beside him with Tally in tow. "Oh, this is sexy," Tally commented, swinging around to the side of the car Nicta was on. "You would look great in this." Nicta's smile was tight, and she dared not look at Sarah, who was by the sign frowning at the price tag. Nicta's hackles went up, and she brushed it off with a wave. "No, I'm just stretching my legs. I think we're looking at something in the small SUV section over there." She pointed to where they had come from. "Nicta," Sarah started. "If you want to look at—" "Nope." Nicta could barely stand the thought of Sarah paying for a go-kart and not expecting anything in return, let alone something that cost more than most people saw in a lifetime, no matter how loaded their family technically was. She didn't want to make it awkward, however, so she glanced at Sarah with a secretive smile. "I feel that the price on this is too much for a first buy, and I think we should keep our focus on something more sensible." The light teasing brought a smile to Sarah's lips, and she dropped the subject. "Very well. I agree with your sentiment, and I applaud you for your financially sound decision-making." Tally frowned beside her, and Nicta quickly took up her hand. "Come on, let's get another look at those minivans." "Hi, yes!" The salesman jumped on it and scurried ahead of them. "We have some great options if you're looking to have kids." Sarah and Nicta paled simultaneously, and this time it was Tally's turn to laugh. Oh, yeah, she played along. I feel that's a conversation we'll save for another time. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.